Hello and welcome to Why the Beatles Matter. I am your most grateful host, Sean Gaylord, and I am very pleased to welcome to our episode Tom Caufield, who, if you have picked up previous podcast episodes and adventures with me, Tom was a guest, maybe a year or two ago on the Principal Liner Notes podcast, and I'm very grateful to have an instrumentalist, guitarist on the podcast, but also somebody who is probably, and we've talked about this, Tom. You have either read as many books as I have on the Beatles, if not more so. And I appreciate your fandom and the deep knowledge and insight that you bring to not only the Beatles but also music. So welcome, my friend.
Hey, man, it's my pleasure. I'm really honored to be here. If the qualifications are mainly that you're a Beatle freak, I am a card-carrying member. Yeah, no doubt about it. Been into the Beatles since I came into the world. They were kind of a formative experience for me. And so, yeah, I'm excited to get into it with you.
Well, let's start at that formative stage because you are a first generation fan, and so you
Yeah.
have kind of very vivid memories and connections to the Beatles, and we are kind of in the midst of a 60th anniversary. Um, even though of the 1964 era and Ed
Right.
Sullivan and all of that, and kind of around the corner um, of that celebration, we are, in December of this year, we will be celebrating the 60th anniversary of your I think what you've said is your favorite Beatles album, Rubber Soul.
Right. Oh, and you and I mentioned texting. I wanted to point out that February 9th, so it would be tomorrow,
That's right, man.
in 1964 was the day the Beatles played on Ed Sullivan, which is where 99% of Americans first encountered them. And I think the count was 73 million people watched them. I don't know if you keep up with television stats. That's a huge number.
Yes.
A lot of the big shows, Super Bowl, that's like Super Bowl numbers. And especially in 1964, that would have, the same way people adjust money for inflation. And like in today's dollars or
Mhm.
those days' dollars, that would have been like 500 more than the population. I mean, that would have been the hugest television audience ever. So it was a very major event. That was February 9th, 1964. So we're right on the anniversary here. Was it
The
61 years? Yeah.
Yeah,
Hmm.
61 years, and the timing
Yeah.
is impeccable
Yeah.
for you being on this particular episode. It being the day, this it's
Yeah.
February 8th at this recording. So, what was, kind of what was your first or earliest memory with the band?
Yeah, let's see what the wisdom of a 5-year-old. What was I making of it all? Well, yeah, now you said you called me first generation, and that's what I used to always think.
Hmm.
But yeah, I've read about 40 Beatle books. Love getting into the history of it and the sociology of it. But technically, they call my generation kind of a second generation
Hmm.
because there was kind of a cohort right before me, and that would have been people born, say, as early as 1948 or 50.
Hmm.
I was born in 1958. So if you were born, the theory is if you were, or the research is if you were born before that, you were never going to get the Beatles. They were just going to like annoy you. You were Sinatra and big bands to the end, but people born 48 to 56, whatnot, were open to rock and roll music. And I've always been really fascinated in the fact that there's a lot of different groups that had a lot of different experiences of the Beatles, depending on your age, your gender,
Hmm.
etc. Um, And I've always wondered, especially, what it was like to see the Beatles arrive with perspective, where you had already seen Elvis Presley come and you'd seen that kind of phenomena happen, because I didn't see that at all, you know. And so by then you would have seen the Beatles with kind of a perspective of like a second wave, you know, coming of rock and roll, and I didn't see that. But anyways, yeah. So for me, um, I was a 5-year old, and uh, up until that night, February 9th, 1964, the the world for me was almost entirely a world of adults. Adults ran the world. Adults were what you saw on the nightly news.
Mhm.
Adults were who populated uh, the television shows we watched. They had the authority. Pretty much, you were just you know you were it was the adults that ran the world and owned the world and called the shots in the world, and
Mhm.
that was there was really no question, no argument. Um, what was amazing about the Beatles was how much of that changed in just a flash the minute they walked out and played, because in the media and in your at your friends' parties or in their get-togethers or in the neighborhood, you had never seen anybody that had the kind of that presented in a youthful way, that had so much power and authority and was getting so much of the attention of the world all at once. And that's what was
Mhm.
immediately striking, was here were people that looked like they had the youth that you had, but suddenly they were a very predominant force, and you had never seen that before. It was kind of the big bang of youth culture. And I think that
Mhm.
kids since and kids now are kind of used to um, younger people, their taste and their human rights and their voice at the table,
Mhm.
um, having more of being respected and being given equal footing a lot of the time. But that was not the case before then. I think it might be a little strong to say kids were second class citizens, but they certainly weren't taken as serious. And once the Beatles came, you had a role model, and you had a case where the perspective of youth was taken very seriously. The crazy thing about the Beatles, too, you have to remember, was they looked incredibly different
Yeah.
because of, for starters, the long hair. There wasn't a boy in sight that had long hair back then. It was as if we all started walking around or floating around in hot air balloons or something. You could make 10 different metaphors. It was very peculiar to see young men with very long hair.
Mhm.
And it was at the same time, it was defiant. It
Mhm.
was somebody saying, we don't do things the way you do it. It had a bit of a feminine patina to it. There had previously been pretty distinct gender models.
Mhm.
And men, the idea of a man was, a, a button-down Oxford shirt, a shorter haircut, um, and the Beatles were wearing a kind of a collarless shirt, and they had this long hair. Um, they
Mhm.
had an air about them that was defiant, and they looked like they were having the best time in the world. And what was interesting was how pervasive their effect was. A lot of people have talked about the biggest moment wasn't so much that night, was the next day at school, when everybody had seen them and everybody was suddenly transformed. All the girls were in love with them. All the guys immediately didn't show right away, but started growing their hair long if they could get away with it. Everybody had to go buy a guitar, and everybody had that sense of humor. Everybody was trying to talk in a British accent. And I like to say, and I always want to be careful about this, to not, you know, uh, step on anybody's idea of the real importance of things, but I think what I always try to say to younger people when I talk about the effect of the Beatles is that I think that they're possibly assuming you're talking about how influential they were and you're comparing it to other musical acts of the day. You say, maybe to a younger person, they were the biggest phenomenon of the time, and maybe in their mind they think, well, he must mean something like Taylor Swift or something like that. But I think what you have to remember was when the Beatles came along, it was much more like a world event. It was, say, like the advent of the internet
Mhm.
or like the advent of the iPhone or or something like 9/11 happening or something. It was a very, very world-shattering cultural event where everything was different, starting with them. And most of everybody's behavior started to change and their interests changed. And there was a kind of um, you could sense that the Beatles were very much for what, in their perception, was an Enlightenment perspective. And so they were kind of defying authority a little bit. They had an attitude about them that the world had to start to lean more into things like civil rights, into feminism, and into a lot of things that were, you could say, are part of the Enlightenment idea. And I think they gave a green light to a lot of that and gave a jump start to a lot of those social movements of the early 60s. And they were a big part of why those were able to gain traction. So getting a little bit ahead of the story there, but
Oh man.
that was how it started for me.
No, I think that's just so beautifully wrought there, Tom. And the thing that kind of sticks out to me in that analysis is often, like we get stuck in maybe the hype or the hysteria of the initial moment. So yeah, yesterday it being February 7th, that's the day that the Beatles, came and landed on American soil, and the
Right.
famous footage of them descending the airplane and
The press
photographers
conference,
and
right?
press conference, all those at JFK Airport. But I appreciate your insight. Is it's not necessarily the initial moment, it's the next day.
Yeah.
It's what happens afterwards. It's what's coming next. And you just kind of listed a string of various world changing events where after that initial event, the next day, everything changed. Everything was different. And I think that speaks to the Beatles' impact when we talk about the Ed Sullivan Show, for example. There's the story, and you make a sly reference to it, that everyone got a guitar the next day. Guitar sales went
Right.
up. Uh,
Right.
Men, boys started pushing their hair forward.
Mhm.
All these things started happening the next day, which
Yeah.
shows that kind of impact in history. You think about we think about November 22nd, 1963, and everyone remembers where they were, but the next day, the
Right.
resonance, the echo, if you will, and the Beatles. I just again, that's just such a great insight, man.
Well, it's incredible that they got such a huge reaction from the American youth.
Mhm.
And it's been analyzed, endlessly since then. And they were very exotic. Now, America had been primed a little bit for a lot of people kind of credit it to their Britishness. Their Britishness was very unique and interesting. It was exotic.
Mhm.
And now America had been primed for a little bit of Britishness because of the James Bond movies.
Right, right.
And he was very suave, and he we're all suckers for the accent, the kind of the King's English. It sounds very uh, pithy and very eloquent and very wise and very proper. And so when an English person mixes that with an irreverent wit, it's a great kind of combination, almost ironic combination. But a couple big British things right before the Beatles were Mary Poppins had come out, and
Hmm.
Poppins ruled. I'm telling you, when you were a kid, Poppins was insane. I mean, the way it mixed, uh, she came down from the sky in the umbrella. Once again, it was kind of an anarchy where the kids' vision of the world kind of supersedes and overrides the adults' vision. It mixed the animation, Dick Van Dyke's chimney sweep, and Mary Poppins, who comes down in a umbrella, take the kids into this wonderland where they make the banks irrelevant and the
Hmm.
bank crashes, and they just all finally get their father to go out and fly kites in the field with the whole town. And so there was a kind of thing that the British were offering, some kind of visionary wonderland. And I have a friend that I talk about the Beatles with, and he put it another thing really well once when we were talking, that I think's interesting to think about. So, okay, once again, talking a little bit to younger people who might not know the details of the story. So Beatles were a band for about 4 or 5 years before they got signed and
Hmm.
blew up. Now, they were not playing any of their own songs yet, maybe a few, but they didn't really matter. They weren't
Yeah.
even that good. Nothing you've ever heard. And they were struggling to get a record deal. They had a manager, and he had gotten them a very key audition, but they didn't do too well at it. They were nervous. They weren't playing their own material, and they kind of blew it. They had been kind of like, if you know the story of J.K. Rowling and Harry Potter, they had been, I think it's the same number, they had been turned down by about a dozen labels, and their manager didn't really know where to go. So he took them to a producer named George Martin. George Martin took them in the studio, and he said, "Well, play me something." And they played uh, someone else's song again. And
Hmm.
then they played one of their own songs, and you and I can get into that offline, but I don't think it's a very great song. It's an okay song, but he signed him. Now think about this. We think of the Beatles as the guys who wrote Penny Lane and Strawberry Fields and A Day in a Life
Hmm.
and Help and Ticket to Ride. They had written none of those songs. They hadn't shown they could write any songs,
Yes.
but he signed them. So it's interesting that he sensed something in them. And it's interesting that they turned out to be as talented as they are.
Yes.
And nobody knew that for sure. But he took a chance on these very enthusiastic kids. Maybe it was charisma, maybe it was some X factor, maybe it was just intuition. But it's so interesting that they weren't just good enough or had a few hits or were kind of good, but they were epoch changing good. They were culture changing, culture transforming people.
Yeah.
And he could see that before, or he at least took a chance on something he sensed. And we're all just so fortunate that they turned out to be as talented as they are, you know. Um, I'll wind this point up with a phrase that I read called the zone of proximal influence, and
Mhm.
it's a $10 phrase, right?
Yeah.
What happened with the Beatles, and I think in culture a little bit, was they looked youthful, but they looked like grown-ups.
Mm.
So they had kind of there were ideals of the younger culture that the old guard was kind of resistant to. They were kind of keeping up a model of society that was a bit oppressive,
Mhm.
especially to minorities, to women, and to uh, they had ideas of imperialism and all kinds of things that were very solidly in place. And the Beatles, being younger people and more kind of peace brothers, kind of enlightened thinkers, that wasn't their view. And there were forces brewing in the country that were against that kind of oppression and that kind of inequality. And because the Beatles presented as youthful and adults, youth could trust them and identify with that influence and felt empowered by it. And it also had the authority of an adult's voice because they were clearly over the age of 21, say, and they were worldly. And so kids could take, it was kind of a gateway where kids could feel like they were starting to understand the issues of adulthood, if it was political issues or if it was issues about relationships or about the complexity of uh, the social challenges of going to school, dealing with your peers, or your opinions on things like the war or inequality or race. The Beatles were not at first saying those things very um, very plainly, but they were telegraphing their view of those, and it was usually on the side of a kind of enlightened view of society, and kids were picking up on that, and it was presented in a way they could do carefully and slowly, that they could kind of start absorbing it, and they were listening. A lot of times in interviews, Beatles would talk about things they were reading or people they admired. If it was Martin Luther King, or if it was Timothy Leary, or if it was um, other musicians, or a lot Stevie Wonder or something. And so we were all picking up on their influences, which were widening our perspective on the world. And they were just old enough to be like our mentors or our older sibling, yet they were old enough to have the authority of our parents in a way. They were almost competing, or they were competing with our parents as the voice of authority. So the zone of proximal influence was in effect because of that 10, 12 year jump they had on us, yet they weren't too old.
Yeah, man. To I want to touch on your Mary Poppins point because I've not looked at it in that way. I mean, I love that film and remember, my mother taking my brother and my sister um to see Mary Poppins in the theater in one of the Disney re-releases in the 70s. And I remember greatly appreciating that film as a child. And somewhere in an alternate universe, instead of the Sherman brothers, Lennon and McCartney provide the soundtrack to that film. There's a lot of
Yeah.
moments in that film which you can almost that foreshadow like Magical Mystery Tour or
Yeah.
Yellow Submarine,
Yeah.
and those things. And also, we're my man John Coltrane is perched on my shoulder here. And earlier this week we celebrated the 60th anniversary of his masterpiece, A Love Supreme. But Coltrane also covered Chim Chim Cheree
Oh,
uh,
yeah.
as well. But
Yeah. Yeah.
which is
I've
which
heard that.
which is real which
Mm.
is a really cool version. But as I'm thinking about this kind of the zone that you mentioned, and how for me the Beatles, they were a pathway to different things. So being a kid, in the late 70s and 80s, and reading all of those books and seeing that, okay, the Beatles were influenced by Bob Dylan. So then that led me to discover Bob Dylan. The Beatles were very much influenced on Long Tall Sally by Little Richard.
Yeah.
So I wanted to know more about Little Richard, or the B
Right.
side of Help. I believe
Yeah.
it was I'm Down, or may have been Yesterday. I forget.
Right. Which
Uh,
record? Which record did you say?
I'm Down. Was that the B side of Help or the B side of Yesterday? I know they were both
Ah,
recorded on the same day.
yeah, 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 they were. I'm trying to think which one.
We'll have to
Yeah,
do some quick. I'll have to ask the guys in
yeah,
research.
yeah.
right now. But I'm Down was basically an homage to Jerry Lee Lewis. So I
Right,
wanted to learn more about Jerry Lee Lewis, and then of course landing us on Rubber Soul and
right.
hearing the sitar on Norwegian Wood, and then Harrison was influenced by um, Ravi Shankar, but he heard Ravi Shankar through David Crosby and the Byrds. So all these kind of pathways that I would explore and jump into, and landing on what I consider, and I just this week in my class we've been spending some time with Rubber Soul, which I know is an album that you have spent a lot of time with, and I would just love
Absolutely.
to hear your take. I know. Maybe a year or two ago in your email newsletter in which you take some deep dives and musings you've written
Right.
about Rubber Soul and so beautifully. So I'd love to hear your take and insight on that album in the context of the history and zone and all those things that you mentioned, because it is a significant album.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, I just wanted to mention kind of a finish up on a couple things, get right to it. But yeah, did you want to did you want to quickly tell everyone how the albums were different?
Oh yeah.
The US and UK. Did you want to maybe just give an
Yeah, we can
overview
we
of
can
that
we
for?
can go there. So basically, there are several versions of Beatles albums, and what probably from about 86 on, the Beatles estates and Apple Records got all their acts together, and what we
Right.
determine as the canon,
Right.
the UK albums,
Right.
which
Well, I mean, but when you say there were several, but I mean mainly there was the way the Beatles records came out sort of two ways in the back in the day.
right,
They were a British band signed to a British label, so they put the British albums out, but their subsidiary to release their records in the United States was Capitol.
right,
Now, Britain had an album tradition that was a 14 songs is what went on an album. And if something had been released as a single previously, it was not included on the album,
right,
which I personally find kind of crazy, but that's what they thought because they thought it was gouging your customer again. I always thought it was kind of putting the single in context, But so then Capitol and America had a tradition that albums had 12 songs, and this wasn't just aesthetically; it had to do with what the max they wanted to pay a songwriter for, and all this boring stuff. But so English albums traditionally had 14 songs. American albums had 12.
right.
American albums traditionally included the singles, British albums didn't. So every time the Beatles put an album out, the Beatles' American label, subsidiary Capitol, would take two songs off that they thought were weak, and they would also put the single on, but they had to make room for that. So they take two more songs
Yeah.
off. And so every time the Beatles made two albums or two more singles, they would have enough for a whole another album.
Hmm.
So the net effect for you young folks is just to point out that if you line up the records by the Beatles that came out in America, it's a different string of albums that came out in Britain. And if you were an American kid, you didn't really even know about the British records.
Right.
You knew about the American records. And there's people that are real critical of the American versions, but I am not. I actually think the American versions are pretty great. But I mean, most people, like I think you were where you're going, I want you to tell me how you feel. Most people consider the British canon the official because it's what they intended. So,
Yeah, and for me, I I look at it, differently, and in some ways too. For me, the American albums,
what you grew up with, yeah.
yeah, that's what people grew up with, and that's what I
Right,
knew, and
right,
and so I recognize that. But then I remember, like, when I heard friend of mine from Canada when I was a kid sent me the British version of Revolver, and I remember that kind of being blown away by that.
Right.
And
Mm.
oh man, this album is so much more. It's so much more full. It's so
Yeah.
much more than what I know. Uh,
Right.
but you know, I think for me, it's taste and preference. I'm not one of those. It's all or nothing when it comes to the
Yeah.
British or the United States album
Right.
versions. I do appreciate the mindset that the Beatles had in terms of, uh,
Right.
hey, we want to make sure you get your money's worth, and we're not going to just build an album around a single, which is still a practice that happens today. And sometimes the
Right.
album has filler and things that are
Right.
inconsequential.
Well,
So
the great thing about the Beatles, even before it was kind of people, I guess, didn't think so much in terms of building albums back then. As you and I know, Sinatra did a couple of concept albums, and
exactly.
there were theme albums, but a lot of times, like you say, they were built around a single. Someone recorded a great song. It was everybody was surprised it was a hit,
Hmm.
and they had to rush an album out, and it was filler. And you couldn't trust albums back a lot of time before
Mm.
'68 or so. A lot of time I spent a lot of money, is a lot of lawn mowing money and snow shoveling money to get, an album by the 1910 Fruit Gum Company, or, the Archies, thinking it was going to be chock full of songs as good as Sugar Sugar or something, but it was not,
Was
it
not.
was, yeah, because writing is the thing, I don't know, right. If you made a hierarchy of what what matters in music, I'll tell you it's the quality of the writing that can make the big difference in whether a song really connects with you or not. And the Beatles, so that was something else I just always want to talk about, which is I grew up listening to the radio of the 60s. Now, this is also something younger folks might be foreign to them. We live in a niche culture
Hmm.
where if you go to Sirius or if you stream or playlists or whatnot, everything is divided into its like categorical similarities. But the golden age of AM radio was playing everything. It was widely eclectic. If you turn, yet weirdly, it all shared some X factor that it was sounded very cohesive. Just as time goes by, it just is very identifiably 60s music, But I mean, if you look close at anything by the Supremes or Otis Redding or Stax or Muscle Shoals or Joe Meek or the Byrds or people in Chicago, the Buckinghams, or people out of New York. You had British Invasion, you had Jangle Pop, you had Folk Pop, you had novelties, you had Harper Valley PTA, you had Psychedelia. I had Too Much to Dream last night. You had novelty songs. They're Coming to Take Us Away, or the Monster Mash. You had Born Free, which was a kind of a classical uh, piano with an orchestra, kind of a
Hmm.
classical instrumental piece. And you had um, you had more, and it all just existed side by side. Creedence Clearwater, you had roots rock, you had swamp rock, Poke Salad Annie, it was
Yeah.
amazing. And they just were shoulder to shoulder, one after each other, a very integrated melting pot of music. And that's how I grew up. And it was a beautiful thing. Now, one of the reasons the Beatles, I think, are so powerful is you can liken this to any field where there's a giant in the field and how much they stand above the crowd. Michael Jordan's the great example.
Hmm.
You see somebody play, one team play back in the 80s, whatever, early 90s. Then you see Michael Jordan play. It's a whole different
Yeah.
thing. I mean, it's a whole different thing. When a Beatle record would come on, by some miracle of how good they wrote, come on, they're Paul McCartney's voice. I mean, that's just not another rock and roll voice. That is some kind of miracle. I mean,
Hmm.
his vocal power, it's so gorgeous, it's so creamy. He can put an edge on it. He's got range for miles.
Yeah.
Um, George Martin, the productions were elegant. They were arranged, they were coming out of those Abbey Road, those old German tube consoles and World War II English consoles. They had kind of a, a separation and a distinct clarity that the American records didn't exactly. American records almost have more vibe, but the combination of those two always made the Beatles a gold standard, and that was a big influence when your title of your show, Why the Beatles Still Matter. They instilled in my DNA, like a gold standard. And I don't think I always live up to it, but it's in me that to strive for that. And I think you feel that too by what I've heard you talk about. And that was a big thing about, why they were, I think, really influential and why they've lasted. But let's jump to Rubber Soul. So Rubber Soul uh, was another one of those records that had its English version and its American version. And I heard the American version. Now, we talked about that the American label would truncate these records, would reimagine them for an American audience. Well, what had happened in the 6, 7 months before Rubber Soul came out was a folk rock boom. Bob Dylan's influence had finally escaped kind of the smaller niche and genre of the folk scene, and he had made some electric records. And then an electric band in Los Angeles called the Byrds covered some Dylan songs, and it was very popular. It sold big, especially teenagers and uh, older teens really liked it because it was a little more socially conscious. The subject matter wasn't so much just about joy and freedom and frivolity and excitement, but it was more about the issues of uh, struggling, peer pressure, struggling with your parents, learning to interact with the opposite sex, dealing with rejection, dealing with insecurity, dealing with disagreeing with the actions of your government or your parents, and a much wider lyrical palette, which, as we know, they got from kind of Bob Dylan kind of kicked that door open with a number of other people that we don't remember as well. But uh, so when the Beatles made their English album of Rubber Soul, it had a lot of acoustic material on it, but there were a couple real acoustic gems that had been left off the previous Beatles American album, which was called Help, because once again they had taken them away to make a shorter Help version. And as you know, they even made room for some of the soundtrack, the orchestral soundtrack of Help. So that's a whole nother story. But a lot of songs had been left off Help. And they wanted to cash in, whoops, as they say, on this folk boom. So they took away the songs on the English Rubber Soul that had more of an electronic or pre-psychedelic patina, and they replaced them with some acoustic songs from the Help album that the Beatles hadn't been able to put out here yet. And they also removed a couple things that George had done that had a bit more of an overt Indian influence to make it kind of like a straight folk rock record. And a lot of people really responded. That this was a case, I think, where Capitol did a nice job. It made the album really cohesive, and it gave it all a unified palette that allowed you to really get uh, drawn in and enticed by the subject matter of the material. And it was mesmerizing. You came to this place and you stayed there for 35 minutes, everything built on itself without jumping too far afield.
Yeah.
And it had a sophistication. And for people like myself that I really like things a little softer on the edges. It took away any kind of abrasiveness that you have to take along with the bathwater with electric music, and just let you get enveloped in a very soft, sort of corners sanded off a little bit kind of sound. And it's a lot of people's favorite Beatles record because, again, because of uh, that proximal influence that it was dealing with adult themes that you were just starting, in my case, as like about a 9 or 10-year-old, to start to perceive in with the opposite sex or with your friends, themes of insecurity or being liked or attracted or people accepting you or rejecting you. And John Lennon especially was talking about pain would lead to pleasure, and why must I fight? Something about sleeping in the bathtub, and
Yeah.
um, you know George was saying, you think for yourself because I won't be there for you. Paul was speaking some French. You were getting a bigger, expanded idea that there was a bigger world out there that involved a lot of subject matter that was just starting to come onto your radar, but you didn't understand. And they weren't intimidating you with it, but they were just putting it out there. They were letting you know that some things were coming and giving you a little bit of vocabulary to start to anticipate these things, a little bit of vocabulary that um, you recognized as things you were starting to feel. And it was very impactful.
Yeah, that's a pretty solid encapsulation of both versions of Rubber Soul, and both albums, although programmed differently, still lead you to a kind of the same place,
Yeah,
in many ways. And it for me, Rubber Soul is, and I love that whole story with the Beatles and the Beach Boys and this kind of
right,
healthy competition. Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys listens to Rubber Soul and goes to his bandmates and says, "The Beatles have made the greatest album of all time. What are we going to do?" So then we have Pet Sounds, which is again this other kind of quantum leap, this
yes,
Kansas to Oz journey that the
right,
Beach Boys make, very similar to where the trajectory of the Beatles. And Pet Sounds, which is just there's no mention of surfing or cars or beach anywhere
right,
on that album. It's a very sophisticated album. Well, Paul McCartney hears that album, goes to the Beatles and says they've made the greatest album of all time.
right,
What are we going to do? And they kind of
right,
fool around
mm,
with that on Here, There, and Everywhere on the follow up to Rubber Soul, with Revolver. And there's albums, and that album again is another quantum leap. But really, it's the leap from to Revolver to Penny Lane and Strawberry Fields to Sergeant Pepper, and
right,
Brian Wilson kind of while the Beatles are working on that goes to Good Vibrations. He's working
right,
on Smile Project, which is supposed to be better, and another kind of extended quantum leap. He hears
right,
Strawberry Fields Forever and on the highway, and pulls over
yeah,
and says the Beatles have done it.
yeah,
And so to me that kind of notion that this album is a catalyst, and you have all these things going on, in the world, in the studio, and artists very much in tune with the world, responding to the world, but then
yeah,
also responding and reacting to each other. There's just this really neat
yeah.
synergy that
Yeah, well, I want to
that's
call
going
it
on.
like a healthy competition.
Yeah.
Not really competition. You could say inspiration. Sparking.
Yes.
Sparking. It's like when you climb a mountain, you think you see the peak, but you climb a big, hill, and you see, oh, it's farther than I thought. They were seeing higher vistas.
Yeah.
Brian Wilson was, he had done California Girls, he had
Yes.
done Girl Don't Tell Me, Let Him Run Wild, and now he hears Rubber Soul, and now he sees even a higher vista,
Yeah.
and then he hears Sergeant Pepper, and he hears that he's in a higher vista,
Yeah.
and Good Vibrations. That stands with Penny Lane, and I mean, he got there too.
Yeah, he did. He
That's
did.
quite, yeah. It's really something. But exactly, it was a great spark, and all these things keep opening up the what do they call it? Kind of a permission structure,
Yeah.
how much you can express, how that there aren't these inhibitions on sitting down with your instrument and what you can express emotionally, what subject matter you can choose to express, and how much music you can throw on that canvas,
Yeah.
just astounding, time to live in real time.
Yeah, as I was telling, my students the other day about Rubber Soul, and trying to make a connection to them, being 18, 19 years old and
Right.
taking their first step into adulthood. And I said, Rubber Soul is kind of like that reinvention, if you will, as you're trying to, as you're aware of your adulthood and you're asserting yourself as you would in college. And I made the distinction, like, there may be some of you that are in the midst of this reinvention as you're embracing your adulthood, and maybe back home you're Tommy, in your neighborhood, and but here in college, no, I'm Tom, and
Right.
I'm not, playing, I'm not playing games anymore. I'm not on the football team anymore, the baseball team. I'm in my Satra phase, or
Right.
or what have you. And I said, Rubber Soul is kind of like that album of you're aware of the first sparks of adulthood, and now you see those sparks, and now you're going to take a step towards them. And begin this process of metamorphosis, of transformation, and you start hugging that world a little bit.
It's kind of it's right at the beginning of, yeah, what I would call kind of a young adulthood,
Yeah.
when you kind of are going to let, yeah, pure childhood go. I would like to recommend an extracurricular assignment for your students.
Go
If
ahead,
you
man.
want to take me up on it, um, I'll- uh, if you want to know the Beatles, if Mr. Galliard has sparked your interest, or he and I or anybody has made you say, what, I don't really hear it. It sounds really like some old music or something, but you really want to try to get it. Back in the day, there wasn't so much demand on our attention span. I was reading it talk about back in the day. I was reading about how, for example, when in the old days, when in a book called Slowness, when you would get a letter from a friend, when you wrote a letter to a friend, first of all, you knew they weren't going to even read it for a week. So you weren't going to be able to have second thoughts about what you said. You had to make sure you liked what you said, and
Hmm.
you had to stand on it. Then you had to think a lot about them getting it, and then they read it, and they read it over and over, and then they had to think about their reply and send it back to you, to the sender, and that
Hmm.
was going to take a couple weeks.
Yeah.
So communication was slowed down a lot. There's ways in the past where communication had a different timing than it does now with our cell phones. So checking out the Beatles, just in my opinion, would take a little bit of slowing down. And if you take the American version of Rubber Soul, which is easy to assemble on Spotify,
Hmm.
it's 34 minutes long. Now, here's the key: lock yourself in a room with it. Good fidelity, if you have good headphones or good speakers, not earbuds, and certainly not just off the phone. Um, and listen to it, paying strict attention to it, undivided attention to it for 34 minutes. I want to say I'm pretty confident it'll have you hooked in 3 minutes anyway, and you won't want to leave. But if you can give it 34 minutes, I, I want to say I have I feel there's good odds you'll get pretty mesmerized by it, and you'll have a very good idea of what the Beatles experience at its best is, and you'll be pretty impressed by the craftsmanship, the depth of feeling, the invention, the just elegance and execution of everything, the melodies, the rhythms. It's
Hmm.
a fantastic experience. So see if you really want to know what they're about, it'll take you 35 minutes and just shutting everything out. So that's my suggestion. Mm.
That's a great assignment, and definitely, I will definitely encourage the class to do that. And I may even have them do that with something like Revolver, which again is an album
Yeah.
that really is headphone
Yeah.
ready. That album is just I mean, there's so many things going on in that album, but I
Well,
appreciate.
I would be interested to see what they have to say about Revolver, because to me, Revolver almost sounds like a sampler or something.
Yeah.
The jumps to genres are so So the net effect is of jumping around a lot, where I
Yeah.
like Rubber Soul to me is just cut of one very cohesive thing. And so
Yes.
that would be interesting actually to listen to both of them back to back, to see because some people think Revolver's the greatest of the Beatles
Yeah.
albums. So
I,
yeah.
yeah, we may do that in class actually. I may encourage I could see us either taking the American version of Rubber Soul and just saying,
Yeah.
all right, I need everybody to take everything out of their hands,
Turn the lights off.
turn,
Yeah.
yeah, and put your phone away and listen to this album. Or I may encourage them, because our class is in Smith Library, and there's a lot of nooks and crannies that you could, just kind of go. And I just may say, take this album and go someplace and listen to it from beginning to end by
Yeah.
yourself,
Yeah.
and then
Yeah.
come back in 35 minutes.
And
It's
everybody will talk about it. Yeah.
yeah, that might
That
be
would
that
be,
that might be the better move. Yeah, and
yeah.
because you're right, it does
Because then
require deep
yeah,
listening.
your class has actually carved out the time. So
Yeah.
that's fantastic. Yeah. Sean, let me ask you, I realize you're in the perfect position to speak to something I think about a lot, which is the title of your podcast, Why the Beatles Still Matter. So still matter, you're seeing a group of younger people every week. And how do the Beatles still matter to a younger generation? Or do they matter in a way they're conscious of? Or do you feel that they matter because the Beatles helped build a world that these young people live in? Or how would you speak to that? How do the Beatles still matter to the new youth of the world, if at all?
Well, I would say the older that I get, and having been in education, this is my 33rd year in education. So I find that the farther distance we have from the Beatles, the less chances that kids are to land there. Now there are a few entry points for that. If a kid is lucky enough, they will know and recognize the Beatles. So I would say that there are many who don't know the really who could not recognize the band or recognize a song by them they unless that has been brought to them, unless that has
Right,
been taught to them, unless they grew up. And so for example, when the first day of my class, very, very few had any kind of recognition. Now, again, it's the first day class and people are shy. And then the more I have played things, there will be something where a student will say, "Oh, I remember my grandmother playing this for me in the
right,
kitchen," or I remember dancing, with a relative to Twist and Shout. I didn't know it was the Beatles. So there is that piece, and then the connections that or for you and I, knowing what is Beatlesque. So if we listen to a band like XTC, listen to an album like Skylarking or Oranges and Lemons, you hear that
we
1960,
know where it's coming from.
you know
Yeah,
where it's
right.
coming from. Or Todd
Yeah,
Rundgren, who produced
yeah,
Skylarking, or the Raspberries.
yeah.
You hear, this kind of, oh, it's a Beatle influence. Or even when Joshua Tree came out, an album that has nothing whatsoever to do with the Beatles directly. I remember that album being everywhere when it came out in 1987, and the comparison being made, oh, this is your generation's um Sergeant Pepper, because
Right.
that album when it came out, and I remember when I was a high school English teacher, and kind of talking about this very, very topic, and talking about the significance of the Sergeant Pepper album, and making the comparison to um Joshua Tree, and again, this was in the early 2000s, and I said, so what is your Sergeant Pepper? What is your album? And someone said, well, oh, that's like OK Computer, Radiohead.
Right.
But
Right.
further distance we get from albums and that
Right.
there are very few, I would say there are very few folks who get the idea of the album as an event or a collection
Yeah.
of songs that are strung together that tell a story or invoke a mood. And when you pull out an album and you see the pictures on the back and or if it's a gatefold album, and you go in there like here's my Dylan Greatest Hits 2 and you open up the
Yeah.
album, you see different things. Maybe you see the lyrics. Maybe you're looking for the story or the inside jokes, and that's lost. That whole art form is
Absolutely. Could
is
you
is
could
lost,
you
gone.
could you hold the Rubber Soul album cover up? I was going to make a few comments about
Yeah,
it. Yeah, so when I first encountered this record, there was a wall of them up at a place called LaSalle's. I think it was 444 and 4. Now, this looks, I once again, if we're speaking to kids or younger adults, and it looks like four dudes from the 60s, kind of maybe so what? I don't know. I don't know what it really looks like to you. But this was a very intense thing to suddenly see when you were a kid. Everybody in the old days in entertainment, now once again, back in the day, the old days might not resonate or whatever, but everybody in show business and music or films, you always smiled for the camera.
yeah,
When the movie was done and you were on the poster, you smiled. When you came out on a talk show, you smiled. It was very striking to see the Beatles not smiling, to
yeah,
see four guys looking straight forward at you. It actually scared people. That actually was frightening to people. They thought they were looking down at a dead body. I don't
yes,
know
I've
where
heard that
exactly
rumor.
that leap
Yeah,
comes from, but or like that they were standing around a grave. And some kids would actually cry when they saw it and want to get away from it. And it's also slightly warped, as we know. It's got the darker tones. So those are the kind of things that you only kind of know maybe if you know the history. And I liked what you were talking about just now when you were talking about the farther away we get from it. Uh, you were talking about the farther we get away from it, the harder it is to feel its impact. I
yeah.
read something a couple of years ago. It was the introduction to a book. A guy wanted to talk about some of the great uh, pop songs of the time of his time. I think he was kind of our age, and in the intro he said, "Well, the book was almost a non-starter before he began because." He had started thinking that he was going to write about these songs that were indisputably the greatest, you know. So he was looking at God Only Knows was going to be his first chapter, but he decided to show it to his son, who was about 14,
Hmm.
and he didn't tell him who it was. And he paired it with some sort of innocuous single, a second tier garage band, a song like Bend Me, Shape Me, or
Yeah, American
Western
Dream.
Union, or something like, that was maybe even didn't chart nationally that high, but maybe was a regional hit.
Hmm.
And so he played God Only Knows, which you and I know is quite a piece of work.
Of
And
course.
then this kind of third tier thing, probably done in someone's garage. And his son just said, "It's all the same. That's just the same thing to me. That sounds just exactly the same. It's just that 60s thing, you know." And so he understood that a lot of these things were going to be time and history bound, you know. I want to think that the Beatles stand apart from that, and I think they certainly would or do if you have a little bit of background knowledge.
Hmm.
But yeah, um, but no, I mean to talk about them as something that has a power or a kind of almost universal characteristic. Uh, in 2006, was it 2016? I think, yeah, I was voting in Brentwood, California, and the line was really long, and uh, it had ended up understaffed, and the voting turnout was much bigger than everybody thought. And by the time we even finally got in the building, everybody had been waiting for like 2.5 hours. Everybody was kind of, shuffling their feet. And there was an upright piano in the corner, and I started eyeing it, and I I just couldn't help myself. I needed to break my own tedium and boredom.
Sure.
So I sat down and I didn't really know what to play. So I started playing Let It Be.
Nice.
And within 2 minutes, half the place was singing along. Everybody knew the words,
Awesome.
everybody lightened up, the mood lightened up. So that's, it was, from 10-year-olds, 12-year-olds knew the chorus. Older people knew all the words. So, there's some power in the biggest of the Beatles songs that I think Imagine is that way. I think Give Peace a Chance is that way. I think some of the biggest Beatles songs really have a universal and almost timeless power.
And and you mentioned the word anthem. I mean, they are definitely anthems for our humanity, and I love that story of you, playing Let It Be. That song has so many different levels and connotations. I real quickly before we wrap up here, for those like you and I who are Beatle freak maniacs and want to get our Beatle facts straight. I just talked to the crack research department here at
Yesterday I'm down. Yeah, right.
yeah. So I just
Yeah.
checked that out with the
Yeah.
with the researchers here in the research department of Why the Beatles Matter, and I'm Down is the B side to Help, and Act Naturally, the Buck Owens
Right. I
song,
remember it
is
now. Right. Yeah.
is the B
Yeah.
side to Yesterday. So, um,
Very. Yeah.
so for those of you who are playing the home version right now, or placing bets and wagers on Beatles trivia, those are the two. The I'm Down is the B side, to Help, which is just a killer song, a killer rock song.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
Um, Tom, real quickly, I'd love for you to kind of share, because I know you are a musician by trade, and I have had the great fortune of hearing your music live, and also the honor of contributing the liner notes to one of your great albums, The Whisper, Resistance, and you are also, you've just come out with a greatest hits album, if you
Yes.
late last year.
I did. I did. Thanks. Thanks for mentioning it to everybody. My music is what I would call contemplative instrumental music. It's kind of based around the acoustic guitar, and it's for kind of chilling out, but I always try to make it in such a way that if you want to pay attention to it, there's going to be a lot of Easter eggs in there, a lot of things to grab your attention and engage your kind of your thinking process. Or it's just good to put on if you want to study or just kick back. So, yeah, that's what I do. My name is Tom Caufield, and my stuff's on all the streaming sites, and it's easy to find. Just look it up, pop it on, and I hope you like what you hear.
And it is featured to
Mhm.
great effect on, I believe, on Sirius XM, and
Yeah.
on the Spa
Mhm.
channel, and which you don't need to be in a spa to groove to Tom's music. It's almost like a mental spa that you can go into your mind and
Yeah.
contemplate. So
Yeah, hopefully it silences the noise. I don't know if it's the same with everybody, but for me, it's like when there's just dead silence, uh, your mind can wander and it might even drift toward things your insecurities or that you're worried about or whatnot. And so this kind of just tries to adjust the silence in a way
nice.
that gives it a little bit of a lift, kind of a patina of optimism, maybe a little bit, or a little bit of hope and a little bit of structure in the void too, so that maybe your mind will mirror that same idea of giving some structure to some things you might be debating inside. And so that's some of the things in the back of my mind when I assemble a record.
Have you covered any Beatles songs, or have you ventured into that realm, or performed Beatles songs on solo acoustic guitar?
I do. I do three. I haven't ever recorded them. I want to get around to putting some covers down, but yeah, in my sort of style, I do a version of Ticket to Ride, which is
Nice.
almost a little bit more like the Carpenters do it. It's
Yes, the slow
right,
version, yes, off their first
laid
album.
back,
Yeah.
and they kind of add that chord, which I kind of found in the chorus. What it is, it's kind of like like a minor seven they add. I'd have to look it up, but and I do a very slow version of "She Loves You," which
Nice.
I enjoy doing, and then I do kind of a rhythmic tap tempo version of "You've Got to Hide Your Love Away" with the capo up high, so it's very birds like, very 12 string,
Nice.
evocative of 65, 66. Yeah. So those are the three. Yeah.
I know you don't take requests, but I see in this kind of Tom Caufield plays the album set list because all three of those songs I've not heard you play, and that sounds amazing. But I see a across the universe.
Ooh.
You know,
Yeah.
that I see that being
Nice.
in your
Nice. So,
wheelhouse of doing something really. I mean, it is a contemplative song. And
sure. Yeah.
I
And acoustic guitar based,
and acoustic
yeah.
guitar based and I have always loved that song. I've always preferred the Phil Spector version.
Yeah.
uh and I'm sure there's some Beatlemaniacs that would.
I'll take you up on that.
Yeah, I see you
I
doing
will.
that,
Yeah.
man.
Yeah, that's a
Yeah,
good one. That's a good one. Thanks for bringing that to my attention. Yeah.
yeah, I see you
Yeah.
doing that. I can't wait to hear it.
Well, man, this has been like water on a plant for me. Just water in that plant. The Beatles, anytime I can reminisce and reestablish the Beatles inside me is
Oh,
really inspiring and nurturing because they're right. They morphed into being right as I morphed into being at the age of like 5, 6, 7, and it's right. It's in my DNA. It's in my brain stem, and it's somewhere, whether it's overt or not, always where I'm coming from. Kind
mm,
of the shape of the way they did things in the high bar, and the kind of eloquence, the catchiness of the melodies, the wistful, the layers, the brevity, hopefully, and all those things. So yeah, I really I'm very appreciative that you asked me to do this with you.
well, Tom, I'm very grateful for you to take time out of a Saturday to meander in all things Beatle, and it's always refreshing to talk with you, and it's always a treat to talk to somebody who gets the joke between Cry for a Shadow, Flying, and Slaggers, and to get all three of those Beatle references, obscure Beatle references, and to appreciate that and to see a smile crack upon your face. It's good to know that I'm not the only Beatle ultra uber geek out there, man. So
Yeah, man, and it's good to be able to say to you and know you know what I'm talking about. Don't let the blue meanies get you, man.
that's right. We will not let the Blue Meanies get you, and we will kill them. No, we won't kill them. We will invite them with love, uh,
Yes,
and
into the submarine.
into the
Yes,
submarine, and
yes,
just make sure to play all together now to
yes,
invite them in.
yes, yes, yes. We'll sing all together now to the bulldog, and very
Nice.
good. Yeah. Yes, very cool, man. All right, man. I will see you on the street.
Definitely.
Okay.
Friends, this is Sean Gaylord with Why the Beatles Matter, and it is my treat and pleasure to have Tom Caulfield here on the podcast. I will be sure to put all of his links to his website and a small recommended discography as well in the show notes. You cannot lose with his music if you're looking for contemplation, reflection, insight, and connection. Definitely
Thanks,
check out
Sean.
his music.
Thanks, Sean. And yeah, and if you do check me out, please join my mailing list. You can do
Yes.
that on the website because that's where I really do my deep dive stuff. That's where I talk about the Beatles and how music affects my life. And if you're a musician, it might speak to you, whatnot. So the newsletter, that'd be the way to go.
Awesome.
Mhm.
Well, as always, stay fab, Tom, and to you, dear listeners, stay fab, and to my students, looking forward to catching you in our next class for some deep listening into Rubber Soul and maybe a little bit of Revolver as well. Catch
All
you on
right,
the other side.
let's go listen.
Do it.